The dust on Outpost 9 smelled like ground iron and burned glass. Gunnery Prefect Skarn stood at the edge of the impact line and checked the sensor board. Every reading was clean. Every recruit had armor. Every recruit, that is, except the small one near the back who appeared to be doing something with her hair. He looked again. She was not doing something with her hair. She was pinning her hair back with a piece of iron. Not a kinetic weave pin, not a polymer clasp. Iron, the heavy, dead planet kind his grandfather's generation had mined from asteroids before the Vaxian forge switched to lighter composites. She had slid the thick iron instrument through her bun with the casual efficiency of someone setting a table. Skarn tapped his data stylus twice against his palm. He did this when numbers were about to do something he did not like. He had 12,000 data points that said what happened to unarmored flesh at this range. Not 12,000 estimates, 12,000 actual recruits across 6 generations of testing, none of whom had survived the recall without kinetic weave. The data was not ambiguous. The data was, in fact, the least ambiguous thing in the Vaxian Kinetic Index, which was an organization that prided itself on being the least ambiguous institution in the known systems. And yet here was a human, 5'3", wearing a thin fabric shirt, standing in line for the Class 4 impact trial as though she had misread the posted requirements and arrived at the wrong event. If you want to hear how this ends, stay close. The staging line for Outpost 9's deep space evaluation had been cut into the barren moon's surface 40 years ago, and in that time, the dust had compacted to something close to concrete. Skarn liked concrete. Concrete had predictable load-bearing values. Concrete did not walk into a kinetic evaluation without body armor and psi. He had noticed the psi. It had happened when the morning briefing covered recall tolerances, the part where the numbers got large and the weaker candidates sometimes asked to use the observation deck instead. Every recruit in the room had gone quiet. Every recruit except the human, who had exhaled through her nose in a way that suggested mild disappointment, as though the recall tolerance data was a commute delay she had seen coming. Her name in the registry was Ilara. Species, human, origin planet, Earth, equipment manifest, 1 field pack, 1 standard issue uniform, 1 unspecified personal tool, iron composite, listed as grandfather's workshop item. Under the column marked armor class, someone, possibly herself, had written the word no in very small letters. Skarn had assumed this was a clerical error. He had not flagged it because in 40 years of range work, he had learned to trust the index's intake process. The index had processed 62 species. It had never accidentally admitted an unarmored cadet to a Class 4 trial. It had standards. It had liability protocols. It had, most importantly, 12,000 data points that made the outcome of an unarmored strike entirely predictable. He had not flagged it. He was now considering, in the quiet, analytical part of his mind, that he kept running even when the rest of him was doing Rangemaster administration, whether that had been a mistake. The thermal ridges along his neck sat flush and flat. This was their resting position. This was the position that meant everything was within acceptable parameters. Skarn checked them the way other officers checked their instruments, and they confirmed what he already knew. The morning was calm, the trial was procedural, and the human in the thin shirt was going to present a brief administrative problem before being redirected to the observation deck. He walked to the staging line. Cadet Ilaro. She looked up from what she was doing, which was reading the impact specifications posted on the range marker with the expression of someone reading a menu in a restaurant they had already decided to leave. Gunnery Prefect. Your equipment manifest. He held out his stylus, pointing at the column. There is an entry under armor class that reads, and I am quoting directly from the registry, no. Yes. He waited. She did not add anything. Cadet, he said, flesh without kinetic weave is dust at this range. The Class 4 dense matter target produces a recall event that has cracked powered hydraulic gauntlets, not damaged, cracked. I have 12,000 recruitment files in the index. Not one unarmored recruit has cleared the recall and remained structurally intact. He paused. Withdraw before the trial begins. This is not a suggestion, it is a calculation. Ilara looked at him for a moment. Then she looked at the range. Then she looked at the impact block, a compressed silicate slab the size of a cargo crate, set at the far end of the firing line, its surface dark with the scorch marks of previous strikes. She sighed. It was the same sigh as this morning, the commute delay sigh. Earth gravity, she said, makes the bones dense, and I had a lot of dairy growing up. She paused, appearing to consider something. Calcium, good for the structure. Skarn stared at her. She had not moved toward the observation deck. He looked at the iron instrument still threaded through her hair. It was a caliper. He could see now that it was a measuring tool, a drop-forged iron caliper of the kind used in old machinist workshops, the grip worn smooth on one handle from years of use. The other recruits had misread it too, he realized. Two of the Groll candidates near the back of the line had glanced at it and then at each other with the particular expression that meant they were silently deciding whether a primitive species had managed a portable shield generator. The Groll were wrong, obviously. Skarn could see it was just a caliper. A very heavy, very old caliper that someone's grandfather had used to measure metal tolerances and that she had repurposed as a hairpin. He did not know what to do with this information. He wrote proceeding, under protest, pending structural waiver verification, in the margin of the intake form and moved down the line. The other recruits were already moving into position. There were 7 of them total, not counting Ilara. The largest was Brack, a Groll recruit, broad enough across the shoulders that he occupied the space of 2 standard-sized bodies, his thick chitinous plating layered in overlapping segments that had been buffed to a faint shine. Brack was the kind of recruit the Index liked. The Index understood Brack. Brack had numbers that made sense. Plating density within certified tolerances, projected impact yield in the expected range for a Groll of his mass, a training record that showed consistent, measurable improvement across each evaluation phase. Brack was also, Skarn noted, watching Ilara the way that large, heavily armored things sometimes watched small, soft things, with the patient certainty of something that already knew the outcome. The range sensors came online with a low hum that Skarn felt in his back teeth. The kinetic barriers on either side of the impact lane snapped up, a shimmer of contained force that would stop any debris from reaching the observation positions. The Class 4 silicate block sat at the end of the lane, inert and enormous, its flat face angled toward the line at exactly the certified testing angle. Skarn called the first recruit forward. The trial was procedural. He told himself this. He had run 12,000 of them, and today was the same as the other days, and the human in the thin shirt was going to walk up to the block and either tap out or receive a structural event and be removed to medical, and he would file the appropriate forms, and the Index would update its numbers from 12,000 to 12,001. He tapped his data stylus twice against his palm. Brack stepped to the impact line. The sensor array angled to track him, its cameras adjusting with a series of small, precise mechanical sounds. Brack set his feet in the certified strike position, weight distributed, dominant shoulder forward, plated forearm raised. The posture was textbook. Skarn had seen it replicated across dozens of species, adjusted for different body configurations, and Brack's version was technically correct in every way that the Index considered measurable. Brack looked at the block. The block did not look back, being a block. Skarn noted the time. He poised his stylus over the readout column. Brack struck. The impact registered at 8,000 joules, a strong number, a good number by any standard metric, the kind of number that earned a solid placement in the upper tier of the recruitment ranking. Skarn was already noting it in the column when the secondary reading came through. He stopped writing. The chitin on Brack's striking arm, the outer segment, the thick layered plate that had been buffed to that faint shine this morning, had cracked. Not chipped, not scuffed. Cracked in a clean diagonal line from the elbow ridge to the middle joint, the kind of fracture line that meant the armored recruit would be pulling that arm close to his body for the rest of the session, and probably for several days after. Brack stepped back from the line. He did not make a sound. Grohl recruits, Skarn knew, considered vocalizing structural damage in a public evaluation to be a social error of the highest order. Brack simply held his arm against his side with the careful, controlled stillness of something in significant pain that had decided pain was not information it needed to share. The other recruits had all seen it. The line went quiet in the particular way that lines went quiet when a large, heavily armored thing absorbed a visible injury at the upper tier of measurable force and then stepped aside. Skarn looked at his sensor readout, 8,000 joules, one cracked chitinous arm. This was the baseline. He looked at Ilara. She had been watching Brack strike with her arms crossed loosely across her chest and her head tilted slightly, the way someone watched a demonstration of a home appliance they were considering whether to purchase. When Brack stepped back, she uncrossed her arms. She looked at the Class 4 block. She looked at her hand, her bare, unplated, entirely biological hand, and she flexed her fingers once slowly, the way someone checked the temperature of water before deciding whether to go in. Skarn's stylus hovered over the disqualification column. He had 12,000 data points. Not one of them ended differently from the same starting position. He waited for her to step back from the line. She stepped forward instead. No one moved. That was the first thing Skarn noticed. He had run enough evaluations to know that a line of recruits had a rhythm to it, a shuffle, a cough, a small repositioning of weight from one foot to the other. It was the sound of organized waiting, and it was always present. But the moment Ilara stepped forward, the line stopped making that sound entirely. 7 recruits, armored, trained, most of them outmassing her by a factor that would require a separate column in the intake form, went still with the particular stillness of things that have decided to pay close attention. Skarn did not lower his stylus. She walked the way she had walked across the staging area, no adjustment to her posture, no drop into a ready position, no shift in her breathing that the environmental sensors could measure. The caliper in her hair caught the flat light of Outpost 9's dwarf sun and threw a small orange gleam across the range marker as she passed it. She stopped at the impact line with her feet roughly shoulder-width apart, which was not a combat stance. It was just where her feet happened to be. She looked at the Class 4 block. The block was 2 meters of compressed silicate, cut from the moon's own crust, and then processed under pressures that no naturally occurring geological event on this moon could have produced. It did not look destructible. It looked like the kind of thing you built things on top of. Ilara tilted her head slightly to the left. Skarn heard his own stylus tap against his palm twice before he realized he was doing it. "Cadet," he said, keeping his voice at the Rangemaster register, flat, procedural, the voice that communicated that the institution had rules and the rules had numbers and the numbers did not care about individual opinions. The trial protocol requires a declared attempt before the sensor array can initialize your baseline. If you wish to withdraw, the window closes at initialization. "I'm not withdrawing," she said. She said it without turning around. She was still looking at the block. Skarn initialized the sensor array. The array responded with the standard sequence, 3 ascending tones, the shimmer of the kinetic barriers tightening 1 increment, the visual confirmation on his readout that all measurement channels were active. He had heard this sequence so many times that he had stopped hearing it. He heard it now, every tone. The third one had a very slight resonance he had never noticed before, a secondary harmonic that the array was not supposed to produce, and which resolved in less than a second into a clean baseline signal that said everything was normal. He noted the secondary harmonic. He noted it and then told himself it was a calibration artifact and moved forward with the protocol, because there was no entry in the index for strange resonance from the measurement array when a human walks to the line, and an entry that did not exist was not data he could act on. "Baseline initialization complete," he said. "Cadet Ilara, you may proceed when ready." She nodded. She flexed the fingers of her right hand the same way she had a few moments ago, that slow single rotation, checking temperature. Then she did something Skarn had not seen in 40 years of range work. She set her hand flat, on the face of the Class 4 block. Not a strike, just a flat contact, palm against the silicate surface, in the way someone tested a stovetop to see if it was still warm. The sensor array registered a force figure. Not from a strike, from a resting palm. The figure came through on the kinetic channel and sat there in Scan's readout for 3 full seconds before he accepted that he was reading it correctly. The number was higher than Brack's impact yield. Not by a small margin. Scan looked at his readout. He looked at Ilara's hand, which was still flat against the block in what appeared to be a casual, exploratory gesture, the kind of contact you made with a wall to check whether it was damp. He looked back at the readout. The figure was still there. The sensor array was not throwing an error. It was reporting a number, a clean number from a clean measurement, and the number did not correspond to any biological baseline for any of the 62 species in the index. Ilara lifted her hand off the block. She looked at her palm. She made a small expression that was possibly the beginning of a shrug. Scan's thermal ridges shifted. Not open, not the full flare that meant maximum stress, just a slight separation at the base, the way they moved when something was statistically unusual and his body had decided to note it before his conscious mind caught up. He did not write the readout figure in the column. He did not know which column it belonged to. Noted, he said, in the tone of someone who had not noted anything correctly. Behind Ilara, the recruits were doing a thing that recruits did when they were recalculating. The Groll candidates in the back, the 2 who had mistaken the caliper for a shield generator, were standing slightly differently now. Their weight had moved back. It was a small shift, barely measurable, the kind of unconscious repositioning that large armored bodies made when the environmental situation reclassified slightly, and the body had opinions about proximity that the mind had not yet consciously formed. Brack, still holding his cracked arm against his side, was watching Ilara with an expression Scan could not locate in his species catalogue. It was not the patient certainty he had worn before his own strike. It was something else, something that had no number next to it in the index. "Cadet," said Scan, and then he stopped, because he did not know what came after cadet in the protocol for this situation, and the protocol existed precisely so that he would always know what came next. He checked his thermal ridges. They were at a 2-point separation, not an emergency, a notification. "The evaluation continues," he said finally. "Cadet, you have completed pre-contact assessment. Move to the certified strike position and initiate your attempt on my mark." Ilara turned to look at him. She had a specific expression on her face, not concern, not aggression, not the performance of calm that recruits sometimes put on over the top of actual fear. It was the expression of someone who had been in this kind of room before and found the room less interesting than whoever had designed the room seemed to intend. "All right," she said. She rolled her right sleeve up to the elbow. It was a domestic gesture, the kind of thing someone did before washing dishes or working at a counter or performing any task that might involve a splash. It was so fundamentally ordinary that 3 of the watching recruits visibly reacted to it, not with alarm, but with the particular confusion of beings trying to classify a behavior and finding their classification system temporarily at a loss. One of the Groll candidates looked at another Groll candidate. The second Groll candidate looked back. No words passed between them. None were apparently necessary. Brack, whose cracked arm was now resting against a support strut on the barrier wall, looked at the sleeve roll the way he had looked at the block before his own strike, as though he was doing a calculation and not getting the expected answer. Scan wrote in the margin of the intake form, "No combat stance, no certified strike position, proceed under observer protocol pending medical advisory." Then he wrote below it, "Readout discrepancy, pre-contact channel, recommend array recalibration after session." Then he looked at what he had written and recognized that he was creating a paper record that attributed unusual data to an equipment fault before he had tested whether the equipment was actually faulty, which was precisely the kind of reasoning that the Vaxian Kinetic Index had built its liability protocols to prevent. He did not cross out the note. The range was quiet. Outpost 9 had a particular silence, not the soft silence of an inhabited place between sounds, but the hard, mineral silence of a moon with no atmosphere worth mentioning and nothing living on its surface except the testing facility and whatever the testing facility had brought with it. In that silence, the faint click of Ilara adjusting her rolled sleeve, tugging it up 1 more centimeter on her forearm, was entirely audible. Skarn became aware, in a way he had not been before this moment, that every single person on this range was listening. The 2 remaining recruits who had not yet taken their turns, a slender Verek and a broad-shouldered Tull, both in full kinetic weave, had gone to the careful stillness that Skarn usually only saw in recruit lines when a commanding officer was describing a consequence they had not expected. Not fear, attention, the specific quality of attention that beings paid when they had updated their model of a situation and were now collecting new data to build the next one. The Verek recruit's sensor band, a standard atmospheric monitor worn around the wrist, gave a short chirp. It was designed to alert the wearer to environmental changes. There were no environmental changes occurring on this range. The sensor band chirped again. The Verek looked at it, tapped it once with 2 fingers, and then looked back at Ilara. Another instrument misbehaving. Skarn added it to the list he was keeping, which was now long enough to be noticeable. Cadet Ilara, he said, because the protocol had a mark and the mark was now on my mark. She was already looking at the block. She had been looking at it steadily for the last several seconds with the kind of attention that was not dramatic, not the focused stare of someone gathering themselves for something significant, but quiet and level, like reading a page. Understood, she said. Skarn lifted his stylus. The range held its silence. He had 12,000 data points. The record was complete and unambiguous, and had been confirmed across 6 generations of evaluation by 24 range masters operating on 3 different installation sites, and none of them had ever had reason to doubt it, because the data was internally consistent in a way that data almost never was, which meant it was either a very accurate model of reality or a very accurate model of a world in which one specific variable, the one standing 30 meters from him in a rolled sleeve, had simply never appeared in the dataset. Mark, said Skarn. Ilara pulled her arm back. Not far, not the full extension wind-up that Brack had used, not the powered stance preparation that the kinetic index had charts for. Just a short, casual draw, the arm bent at the elbow and drawn back about as far as someone drew back a hand to knock on a door. The strike itself was not visible. That was the part Skarn would write about for the next 6 hours, revising the same sentence repeatedly in his incident report. The arm moved. He saw the arm in position, and then he saw the arm at the block, and between those 2 states, there was a duration that the sensor array would later tell him lasted exactly the time it took the system to record a single measurement cycle, and within that duration, nothing his eyes could resolve had occurred. The sound came after, a deep, resonant crack, not the sharp impact sound of Brack's strike, but something lower and larger. The sound of compressed silicate receiving more force than compressed silicate was built to absorb, distributed across the entire target face at once rather than concentrated at a point. Skarn's sensor readout went white. Not an error message, not a calibration flag. White. The entire kinetic measurement channel filled with a flat, bright signal that meant the array had received an input value and did not have a column large enough to hold it. The block had not moved. The dust around the base of the block, however, had. In a perfect ring, equidistant from the block's edges, the packed moondust had jumped. Not blown, there was no concussive wind, no visible debris wave. The dust had simply relocated in a ring to approximately 1.5 feet further from the block than it had been a moment ago, where it now settled with the slow patience of dust that had been told to go somewhere and had gone. The silence after was different from the silence before. Ilara was standing at the line with her arm at her side and her rolled sleeve still at the elbow. She was looking at the block. The block was still there. The block was, in fact, entirely structurally intact. Skarn checked the readout. The kinetic channel was still white. He looked at the block, he looked at the white channel, he looked at the ring of displaced dust. He looked at Ilara, who had her head tilted at the same angle as when she had first approached the block, the same assessing tilt, and was making the small expression that was possibly the beginning of a shrug. The Verek recruit's sensor band chirped a third time. Brack had not moved from the support strut. His cracked arm was still pressed to his side, but the rest of him had gone completely motionless in a way that was distinct from the stillness of a moment ago. That had been the stillness of waiting. This was something else. Skarn's thermal ridges opened to a 4-point gap. He had a readout that said white, and a block that was intact, and a ring of displaced dust, and a recruit standing at the line with her sleeve rolled up to her elbow, who looked as though she was deciding whether to say something. She said something. "It's a bit resistant," she said, with the tone of someone describing a jar with a stiff lid. "Is that the standard model, or is there an older batch in the inventory?" No one answered her question about the inventory. This was not because no one knew the answer. Skarn knew the answer. The block was standard issue, current batch, certified that morning, the same compressed silicate used at all 3 active evaluation sites across the Vaxian Vanguard's deep space installation network. He had the certification number in the intake form. He had personally verified the batch stamp against the manifest before the first recruit stepped to the line, because he was a range master and batch verification was in Section 2 of his pre-trial checklist, and Skarn had not skipped a checklist item in 40 years of range work. He did not say any of this. He did not say it because he was looking at the ring of displaced dust around the base of the block, and the ring of displaced dust had done something he needed a moment to process. Dust did not behave that way. Dust, in Skarn's experience, behaved the way physics told it to. It moved in response to concussive force, it scattered in the direction of the applied pressure, it distributed itself across the available surface area in a pattern that a competent analyst could read backward from the scatter to reconstruct the originating event. The index had a whole subsection on post-impact dust analysis. It was in Section 11. Skarn had read it. The dust around the base of the block had not scattered. It had relocated, in a ring, perfectly equidistant, as though the block had briefly become the center of something that had nowhere to go except outward in all directions simultaneously at exactly the same speed. He wrote anomalous dust displacement, radial pattern, mechanism unclear. He paused. He added, block structurally intact, readout white channel, recommend equipment review. He looked at what he had written. He had now recommended equipment review twice in the same session, for 2 separate pieces of equipment, both of which had malfunctioned in the presence of the same recruit. The liability protocol for that situation was not in Section 4. It was not, as far as Skarn could recall, in any section. It was the kind of situation the protocols had been written to prevent, not to address after the fact. "The block is standard issue," he said finally, because the silence had gone on long enough that not answering had become its own kind of answer, and Skarn did not want to give it. "Current batch, certified this morning." Ilara considered this information. She looked at the block. She looked at the ring of dust. She looked at her hand, the same bare, biological, entirely unarmored hand that had just produced a readout the sensor array did not have a column for, and she turned it over once, examining the palm the way someone examined a palm after a handshake that had gone on slightly longer than expected. "Oh," she said. That was all. Skarn's thermal ridges were at a 4-point gap, and he could feel the warmth of them against the back of his collar. 4 points was not the maximum. The maximum, the full flare, the emergency position, the configuration his body reserved for situations that had exceeded every parameter he had prepared for, was 12. He had been at 12 twice in 40 years. Once during a catastrophic barrier failure at Installation 7, when a misfired kinetic round had taken out the primary containment wall, and he had approximately 4 seconds to redirect 30 recruits away from the impact zone. Once during a calibration error that had briefly registered a recruit's impact yield at 3 times the actual figure, before the system corrected itself and he had realized the error was in the equipment rather than in the recruit. Both times 12 had been correct. Both times something had actually gone wrong. He was at 4. 4 was a notification. 4 was his body telling him that the situation had features that did not appear in the index and that he should be paying attention. He was paying attention. Ilara had lowered her hand. She was looking at the block again with the same quiet, level attention she had given it before the strike, the reading a page attention, the kind that did not perform anything. Behind her, no one had moved. The line of recruits had the texture of held breath. 7 bodies, various sizes, various armored configurations, all of them doing nothing, not nothing in the resting sense. Nothing in the sense of beings who have concluded that moving would be an error and have committed to stillness as a strategy. Brack had not moved from the support strut. Brack was looking at Ilara's hand. Skarn understood this. He was also looking at Ilara's hand. The hand was unremarkable. It was a human hand, 5 fingers, the standard configuration, the skin at the knuckles slightly roughened in the way that skin roughened from repeated contact with abrasive surfaces. There was a small callus on the outer edge of the palm, at the point where the hand would make contact if someone used it to strike a surface repeatedly. The callus was old. It had the flattened, settled look of something that had been there long enough to stop being notable to the person who had grown it. It was not glowing. It did not have visible plating. There were no seams that might indicate a subcutaneous kinetic insert. Skarn had looked, professionally and thoroughly, because if she had a subcutaneous kinetic insert, it would be in the manifest, and the manifest said grandfather's caliper, and no in the armor column, and nothing else. The hand was a hand. It was doing what hands did when their owner was not actively using them, which was exist, at the end of an arm, being biological. The kinetic channel on Skarn's readout was still white. The white channel meant the array had received a value and could not store it. Not that it had received a large value. The array had columns for large values. It had columns for values that would liquefy most of the species in the index, but that it had received a value the array's measurement range did not extend to. The array's measurement range extended to 40,000 joules. This was not a limitation that had ever been relevant before, because no biological organism in 6 generations of testing across 12,000 recruits from 62 species had ever approached the array's upper threshold. He looked at the white channel. He looked at Ilara's hand. He looked at the block, which was still sitting at the end of the lane, intact, in the way that things were intact when nothing had happened to them, except that the dust around its base had moved and the air in the lane had a quality that Skarn's environmental sensors were logging as anomalous pressure differential. Cause unidentified, and the kinetic array was running an internal diagnostic that it had triggered itself without instruction. Because the self-diagnostic protocol activated when a reading exceeded the system's confidence threshold. The array had never triggered its own diagnostic before. Cadet Ilara, Skarn said. She turned. The sensor array is running a diagnostic. He kept his voice at the Rangemaster Register. He was proud of this. The Rangemaster Register was a professional achievement he had worked on for a long time, and it was performing well under conditions it had not been designed for. The trial will pause until the diagnostic completes. Standard protocol. This was not standard protocol. There was no protocol for this situation. He was describing something as standard in order to fill the space where a protocol should have been. Ilara nodded. She did not appear troubled by the pause. She looked, if anything, mildly relieved, in the way that someone was mildly relieved when a task they had not been looking forward to was briefly interrupted. She rolled her sleeve back down. She rolled it back down the same way she had rolled it up. The domestic gesture, the setting a table efficiency, each fold deliberate and unhurried. The Groll candidates in the back watched this with an attention that Skarn recognized as the attention of beings updating a classification. They had started the morning with one model of what she was. They had updated it when she declined to withdraw. They had updated it again when the pre-contact palm reading came through. They were updating it again now in response to the sleeve, and Skarn could see from the quality of their stillness that the update was not producing a comfortable result. Brack had looked away from her hand. He was looking at the block. The block was doing nothing. The block was a block, but Skarn understood, watching Brack look at it, that the block had changed categories in the last several minutes. It was no longer the thing that had cracked Brack's arm. It was now the thing that a human in a thin fabric shirt had declined to describe as a challenge. The diagnostic completed. The array chirped, a single clean tone, the completion signal, the same tone Skarn had heard at the end of every diagnostic he had run in 40 years. He looked at the diagnostic report on his readout. The array reported no faults. He read this twice, then he read the line below it which said, all measurement channels nominal, last recorded value, range exceeded, system limit. Recommend external calibration review at next scheduled maintenance window. The array was not broken. The array was functioning correctly. The array had received a value that exceeded its measurement range, logged it honestly as a range exceedance, and was now recommending that someone look at whether the measurement range should be extended. This was exactly what a correctly functioning array was supposed to do when it encountered data it could not fully record. The array was not malfunctioning, the array was working. The number was simply too large. Skarn set his data stylus down on the sensor board. He picked it up again because setting it down felt like the kind of gesture that meant something, and he did not want to make a gesture that meant something in front of the recruits. He held the stylus, and he looked at the diagnostic report, and he felt his thermal ridges move from 4 points to 6, and then to 7, with the slow, irreversible motion of something that had been building pressure and had finally decided to go somewhere with it. 7 was elevated. 7 was the position his ridges had taken during the installation's 7 incident, in the 3 seconds before he had started moving recruits away from the barrier breach. 7 meant his body had made a decision about the situation before his conscious mind had finished the relevant analysis. He picked up the intake form. He found the line for impact yield, strike attempt. He wrote C-array diagnostic report, range EXC-DANC log, filed separately. He looked at what he had written and recognized that he had just documented in the official trial record of the Vaxian Kinetic Index that an unarmored human cadet had produced a kinetic output that exceeded the measurement ceiling of a military-grade sensor array rated to 40,000 joules. He set the stylus down again. This time he let it stay down. Cadet Ilara, he said, the diagnostic is complete. The array is nominal. He paused. The Rangemaster register held. He was grateful for it. You have one remaining attempt under the trial protocol. The block registers as structurally intact. She had been looking at the dwarf sun while the diagnostic ran. Not at the block, not at the line, not at Skarn. At the sun, the small flat disk of it on the horizon, the way someone looked at a window while waiting for something to finish. She turned back when he spoke. One more, she said. One more. She looked at the block. The block looked like a block. All right, she said. She said it the way she had said all right the first time, as a complete sentence, an uncomplicated agreement, a person responding to a reasonable request with a reasonable answer. She rolled her sleeve back up, the same 3 folds, the same unhurried deliberateness. The Groll candidates in the back had stopped updating their classification. They had, Skarn realized, reached a classification they did not know what to do with, and they were waiting to see if the next 30 seconds would give them somewhere to put it. She walked back to the impact line. She stopped. She looked at the block for 2 full seconds. This look was different from the previous looks. The previous looks had been the reading a page attention, quiet and level and assessing. This look was something else, something Skarn did not have a category for, something that was almost familiar, the look of someone who had done this before, who knew exactly what was coming, and who had decided to do it anyway because the alternative was not walking back to the line. She exhaled once slowly through her nose. It was not the commute delay sigh, it was smaller than that. Just a breath, a small settling, the kind of breath someone took before lifting something they had lifted before and knew the weight of. Then she struck. The arm moved. Scan saw it move. He could not tell you in any amount of subsequent documentation what the movement looked like, because the duration of the movement was 0.34 seconds, and in 0.34 seconds, the human visual system, or the Vaxian visual system, or the visual systems of 7 watching recruits from 5 different species, did not collect enough information to constitute a memory. What he had was before and after. The arm in position, the arm at the block, a gap between them that contained a fact he could not see. The sound was not a crack. Brack's strike had been a crack, a sharp, dense, concentrated sound, the sound of massive force applied at a point. This was not that. This was something that started below the audible range, a pressure that Scan felt in his chest before he heard anything at all, a sudden compression in the air of the testing lane that his body registered as something has changed before his ears received the signal. Then the sound arrived. It arrived the way a structural event arrived, not from a direction, but from everywhere the sound could reach at once, a deep concussive resonance that was not loud so much as total, the kind of sound that had no edges because it occupied the entire available space simultaneously. The kinetic barriers on either side of the lane flared visible, a hard, bright shimmer, the kind of flare Scan had only ever seen when a barrier took a direct impact from a contained explosive. The barriers held. They were rated for containment events, and they held. The block did not hold. He watched it go. He watched it the way he would watch it in the incident report he would revise 14 times over the following week, each revision attempting to find language adequate to what the sensor footage showed and failing. The block did not shatter. It did not crack or split or break along fault lines the way silicate broke when it exceeded its structural tolerance. It detonated, the word was wrong, the word was the vocabulary of a different kind of event, but it was the only word that described the way the compressed silicate became, in a duration too short to measure with the available equipment, not a block but a cloud. A dense, rapidly expanding cloud of fine silicate particulate that traveled outward from the point of contact at a velocity the environmental sensors logged before they also went offline. The kinetic barriers caught the cloud, every particle. The barriers were good at their job. The dust pressed against the shimmer of the containment field and slowed and stopped and hung there for a moment, and then the barriers cycled and the dust fell. No one on the observation side of the barriers received so much as a grain of it. The impact lane was full of settling particulate, fine as chalk, the kind of fine that meant the compression event had been distributed so evenly across the entire silicate matrix that the material had not broken, it had ceased uniformly all at once. Scan's readout did not go white this time. His readout went offline. Not a white channel, not a range exceedance. The entire sensor board, kinetic array, environmental monitors, the atmospheric sensor that had been chirping all morning, the barrier load indicators, the impact camera feed, all of it went dark simultaneously, with the clean, total darkness of a system that had received an instruction it could not execute and had responded by stopping. The board was dark. The lane was full of chalk dust. The barriers were holding their shape against nothing because there was nothing left to hold. Scan's thermal ridges were at 11. He had not been at 11 since the calibration error, and the calibration error had turned out to be equipment. This was not equipment. He had just received a diagnostic report telling him the equipment was functioning correctly, and then the equipment had gone offline, and the distinction between those two facts was so stark that his body had processed it before he could. 11 out of 12. He looked at where the block had been. There was a slight discoloration on the moon's surface, where the base of the block had made contact for the duration of the trial. A square where a block had been. The square was approximately 2 meters on a side, and it was slightly darker than the surrounding surface, and it was entirely, completely empty. He looked at Ilara. She was standing at the impact line with her arm at her side. Her rolled sleeve was still at the elbow. The chalk dust from the detonated block was settling around her in the slow, patient way that dust settled in low gravity, taking its time, in no hurry, the way things moved when there was nothing rushing them. A thin film of it had settled on her shoulders, on her hair, on the iron caliper still threaded through her bun. She was looking at her hand again. She turned it over. She flexed her fingers once, the slow rotation, checking temperature. Then she made the small expression that was possibly the beginning of a shrug. "Bit stiff," she said. She said it quietly, to her hand, in the tone of someone reporting a minor inconvenience to the only person present who would understand it. Behind her, no one spoke. Brack had released the support strut. He was standing unsupported, his cracked arm still held against his side, but the rest of him had straightened, not into a combat posture, not into a ready position, but into something that looked, in Skarn's experience with Groll recruits and their complicated physical vocabulary, like reverence. The kind of reverence that large, armored, heavily plated things extended to things they had recategorized out of the small column, and into a column they did not have a name for yet. The two Groll candidates in the back had taken 2 steps backward, not a retreat. They had not turned. They were facing the impact line. They had simply moved to a distance that felt appropriate for the category they were currently building, and the category required more space than they had previously allocated. The Verek recruit's sensor band had gone silent. It had stopped chirping. Skarn did not know whether this was because it had corrected itself or because whatever it had been measuring had moved beyond the range of its alerts. Skarn picked up his data stylus. He looked at the intake form. He found the line for impact yield, strike attempt, second. He held the stylus over the line for a long time. He wrote board offline C system recovery log, filed separately. He underlined it once. He looked at the underline. He crossed it out and wrote it again without the underline because underlining suggested emphasis, and he did not want the incident report to suggest that he had found anything about this session remarkable. The incident report was a document. Documents had standards. He would maintain them. His thermal ridges were at 11. The chalk dust continued to settle. Ilara unrolled her sleeve. 3 folds reversed. She tugged the cuff down to her wrist and did the small adjustment at the button that indicated she had finished. Then she looked up at Skarn with the expression she had worn all morning, the one he could not locate in any species catalogue, the one that was not concern or aggression or performance, the expression of someone who had been in this kind of room before and found the room about as interesting as she had expected. "Is there a second block?" she asked, "or is that the trial?" Skarn looked at the square of darker dust where the block had been. He looked at his offline sensor board. He looked at his intake form and the lines he had filled in and the lines he had not filled in and the line at the bottom that said evaluation result with 2 boxes next to it, one that said pass and one that said refer to medical. He looked at Ilara. He checked the pass box. He did this carefully, with the precise mark the protocol required, the mark that meant the entry was official and the evaluation was complete, and the recruit had satisfied the index's requirements for the current trial phase. He made the mark, and he looked at it, and he verified that it was in the correct box, and that his hand had not, somewhere in the distance between his intention and the page, accidentally moved it to the other one. It was in the correct box. "That is the trial," he said. The evaluation was over. This was the administrative fact. Skarn had checked the box that said pass, and in the Vaxian Kinetic Index, the checking of a box was a finality, not a tentative conclusion, not a preliminary finding, but a closed entry, a door shut, a number added to the record. He had checked 12,000 boxes. He had never unchecked one. He did not uncheck this one. He set the intake form on the sensor board and looked at his offline readout and tried to remember whether there was a protocol for restarting the board after an unplanned shutdown. There was. It was in Section 7. He found it. He followed it in the correct order, which required him to press 4 specific controls in a specific sequence and wait for the system to complete its restart cycle. And during the restart cycle, he had approximately 90 seconds in which he had nothing procedural to do, and the range was still full of chalk dust, and the square of darker surface, where the block had been, was still there, and Ilara was standing at the impact line with her sleeve rolled back down, looking at nothing in particular. He looked at his thermal ridges. 11, still 11. The restart cycle completed. The board came back online in sequence, environmental monitors first, then barrier indicators, then the kinetic array, which took slightly longer than the others, and returned with a status message that said last session data. Partial range EXCDANC event LOGGD, recommend calibration review. Scan acknowledged the message. He filed it. He created a new session log for the remainder of the evaluation, which was, he noted, now complete, because Ilara had been the last recruit on the list. He looked at the list, 7 recruits plus Ilara, 8 names. He had results for all 8. He had results, he understood, for 7 of them. He picked up the stylus. He went to the column for notes, Rangemaster remarks, which was a column he used rarely, because in 40 years of range work, the relevant facts had almost always fit into the existing columns without requiring additional observation. He had used the remarks column 11 times. He remembered each of them. None of them resembled what he was about to write. He looked at the column for a long time. Behind him, the recruits had begun the small, quiet movements of a line that had been dismissed. Not dispersed, he had not formally dismissed them, but the session had the shape of something finished, and bodies that had been holding the stillness of active waiting were now recalibrating to a different kind of stillness. The 2 Groll candidates had moved to the barrier wall and were standing against it in the way that very large beings stood against walls when they needed the wall's solidity as a reference point. The Verek recruit was looking at his sensor band, which had remained silent since the second strike, with the expression of someone who was not sure whether the silence meant the instrument had fixed itself or had simply stopped trying. Brack had sat down. This was, in Skan's experience, remarkable. Groll recruits did not sit during evaluations. Sitting during an evaluation was, in Groll social terms, approximately equivalent to putting your head down on a table during a formal dinner, not forbidden, but the kind of thing that required an explanation. Brack had sat down on the barrier platform, his cracked arms still held against his side, and he was looking at the square of darker dust where the block had been, and he was not offering an explanation. Skan noted this in the remarks column. Groll recruit Brack, seated post-evaluation, unprompted. He looked at what he had written, and then at the rest of the column, which was still empty, and felt the inadequacy of it in a way that his stylus could not address. Gunnery Prefect. He turned. Ilara was still at the impact line. She had not moved to the dismissed recruit area, the cleared space off to the left side of the staging line where recruits went when the protocol had finished with them. She was standing where she had been at the line, and she had an expression he had not seen from her before, not the commute delay patience, not the reading a page level attention, something smaller than both of those. Something that looked, at a distance, like the expression of someone who was about to say something they expected to be mildly inconvenient. "My caliper," she said, "can I have it back?" Skan looked at her hair. The iron caliper was still threaded through her bun, lightly frosted with the chalk dust of the detonated block. The dust had settled into the worn groove of the grip, the same way dust settled into things it had found a shape in, the grooves of old tools, the seams of worked iron, the places where use had made a path. He thought about the caliper. He thought about it the way he thought about data, what it was, what it had done, what column it belonged in. It was a drop-forged iron instrument. It was old. The grip was worn smooth on one handle from years of use in conditions that had nothing to do with kinetic evaluations, that had to do with measuring things, gaps, tolerances, the distances between surfaces that mattered when you were building something that had to fit together correctly. Someone had used it for that purpose, repeatedly, for long enough that the iron had taken the shape of the hand that held it. She had used it to pin back her hair. He had spent the first 20 minutes of the evaluation deciding what category it belonged in. Shield generator, primitive force field emitter, something he didn't have a name for that explained what he was seeing. It was a caliper. It had always been a caliper. He had known it was a caliper when he looked directly at it. The category error had not been in the object. It had been in him, in the part of him that had looked at the object and at the person carrying it, and decided that something unusual must be present, because the alternative was that an unarmored human in a thin fabric shirt simply did not require explanation. He set his stylus down. "The caliper will need to be logged," he said, "before it can be returned." She waited. "It is a matter of procedure," he added. "All right," she said. He took the caliper from her. She tipped her head forward slightly so he could draw it from her hair, the way someone cooperated with a minor logistical process, and he held it. It was heavy, heavier than it looked, with the specific density of old iron that had been worked under pressure rather than cast, the kind of weight that meant the material had been compressed rather than simply shaped. The worn grip was smooth against his palm. The other handle had the original surface, slightly rougher, the texture of iron that had not been handled as much. He turned it over once in his hands. He was thinking about the pre-contact palm reading, the number that had come through the kinetic channel when she had set her hand flat against the block, before any declared attempt, in a posture that was not a strike but a test. He had not written that number in any column. He had told himself the array was malfunctioning. The array had subsequently told him it was not malfunctioning. He was thinking about the fact that she had then struck twice, and that the second strike had exceeded the first by a margin he could not measure because his equipment had gone offline. He was thinking about the fact that she had walked to the impact line, both times, with no combat posture and no braced stance and no adjusted breathing. He was thinking about the fact that the posture of someone who was holding back looked, from the outside, identical to the posture of someone who was not thinking about the task. He had watched her walk to the line and thought, she does not understand the stakes. He was now revising this assessment. He was revising it in the direction of, she understood the stakes exactly, had made a precise determination of what the situation required, and had delivered exactly that amount and not 1 unit more. This was not the behavior of someone who did not know what they were doing. This was the behavior of someone who knew what they were doing well enough to do less of it. He looked at the caliper. He walked back to the sensor board. He opened a new entry in the equipment log. He found the field for item description and typed, iron caliper, drop forged, single-piece construction, grip worn, personal item, Cadet Ilara, human origin. He found the field for item classification and stopped. He sat with the cursor in the classification field for a moment. He typed biological readiness indicator, carried item, class 9 restricted analog, pending review. He looked at what he had typed. He filed it. He picked up the caliper and walked back to the impact line and held it out. She took it. She threaded it back through her bun with the same efficient, one-handed motion she had used this morning, the motion of someone who had done it so many times that it had stopped requiring thought. The chalk dust shifted slightly when she moved her hair and then settled again. "Thank you," she said. "The evaluation is complete," he said. "You are dismissed to the processing area. Your results will be transmitted to the assignment board within the standard window." She nodded. She picked up her field pack from the barrier wall, the one she had set there at the beginning of the session, with the same unhurried efficiency she applied to everything, and she slung it over one shoulder, and she walked toward the exit lane. She did not look back at the square of darker dust where the block had been. She did not look at Brack, still seated on the barrier platform. She did not look at the offline then restarted sensor board or the chalk-dusted range or the kinetic barriers that were still faintly warm from the containment load they had handled. She walked the way she had walked all morning, no adjustment, no ceremony. At the edge of the staging area, where the exit lane met the service road, she stopped. She looked down at her hand, the right one, the one she had struck with, the one she had checked twice with the slow finger rotation, and she flexed it once, the same way, the same single rotation. "Still a bit stiff," she said, not to him, not to anyone in particular, to the hand or to herself or to no one at all. Then she walked out. Scarn stood at the sensor board for a long time, after the recruits had cleared the range. He stood there until the environmental systems had completed their post-session cycle and the barriers had powered down and the chalk dust in the impact lane had finished settling into the grooves of the compacted moondust floor. The square of darker surface where the block had been was still there. It was going to be there for a while. The discoloration went deeper than the surface. He picked up the intake form. He found the Rangemaster remarks column. He had written, Groll recruit Brack, seated post-evaluation, unprompted. Below this, he now wrote for a long time, in the careful, compressed notation he used when the available space was smaller than the required content. He wrote about the pre-contact palm reading and the range exceedance and the board shutdown and the restart. He wrote about the dust ring and the radial displacement pattern and the precise, total absence of the block. He wrote about the caliper and the classification he had filed, and the reason he had filed it under Class 9 rather than the personal item exemption. He wrote at the bottom of the column, restraint confirmed, bystanders 0 impact, barriers held no exceedance on containment side, recruit unharmed, block eliminated entirely, force differential between contained strike and uncontained capability, unknown, equipment ceiling reached. Assessment, the delivered yield was not the available yield. He underlined the last sentence, he looked at the underline, he left it. He filed the intake form. He opened the Vaxian Kinetic Index Threat Classification Database, the backend system, the one that required Rangemaster credentials and a recorded session ID and a reason code, because changes to the threat classification database were not routine, and the system treated them as the significant events they were. He entered his credentials. He entered the session ID. He entered the reason code, new biological data, unclassified origin, requires doctrine review. The system accepted this and opened a new entry form. He found the field for species and typed, human, Earth origin. He found the field for current classification and typed what the index currently said, which was Category 3, Standard Biological, no kinetic restriction. He found the field for proposed reclassification. He sat with this field for longer than he had sat with the caliper's classification field. The correct answer was not a number he had in his database. The array ceiling was 40,000 joules. The number that belonged in this field was above that ceiling, in a direction the ceiling had been built to be the top of, and yet here he was on the other side of it, trying to describe what was above a ceiling using a vocabulary built for everything below it. He typed Class 9, Restricted Kinetic, Biological Density, EXCEDS Certified Measurement Range, Handle as Armored Heavy. He looked at this. He deleted Armored Heavy and replaced it with Unrestricted Munition, Uncontained. He looked at this. He filed it. The database accepted the entry and generated a pending review notification that would reach the index's classification board within the standard processing window. The board would review it. They would request the session data. He would send them the board log, the array diagnostic, the partial kinetic record, and the equipment log entry for the caliper. They would review all of it, and they would reach a conclusion. And Skarn had a precise idea of what that conclusion would be because he had reached it himself, standing at a sensor board in the mineral silence of Outpost 9, holding a worn iron caliper that weighed more than it should. He closed the database. He sat in the operational chair at the sensor board, the chair he used during active sessions, the one with the correct posture supports for a Vaxian anatomy, the one he had sat in across 12,000 evaluations, and he looked at the empty impact lane. The barriers were down. The dust had settled. The square of darker surface was the only geometry in the lane that had not been there this morning. He thought about the sleeve. Not the strike, not the board going white and then offline, not the dust ring or the detonation sound or the 11-point ridge flare. He thought about the sleeve, rolled up to the elbow, 3 folds, the domestic gesture of someone preparing to do a minor household task. He thought about the fact that he had watched her do it and filed it under no combat stance, proceed under observer protocol and moved on, because it had not looked like a preparation for anything that required documentation. He thought about what it actually was. A person who knew exactly how much force they were about to apply, down to the specific joint mechanics and the delivery angle and the yield management, did not need a combat stance. A person who had done this before, who had done this in conditions that made a deep space kinetic evaluation range look like a calibration test, did not need to adjust their breathing or brace their feet. The preparation was done. It had been done long before the evaluation, on a planet with a gravitational constant that the index had listed in its environmental database as a curiosity rather than a variable, alongside a diet that was apparently very good for the structure. The preparation had been done at the table, eating calcium, growing up. Skarn's thermal ridges had come down to 8 by the time he finished writing the incident report. 8 was still elevated. 8 was the position they held when something had happened that would take time to become ordinary, and he had learned over 40 years to trust that assessment. He looked at the caliper entry in the equipment log one more time before he closed the system. Biological readiness indicator carried item, class 9 restricted analog, pending review. He added one line below it, note, item returned to cadet, logging retained for doctrine file. He closed the log. He sat for another moment in the operational chair, looking at the square of darker dust at the end of the empty lane, and he thought about the 12,000 entries in the index, and about the one entry at 12,001 that was going to require its own appendix, and about the species that had produced it, the species that built things on planets that should have crushed them, that ate calcium by the kilo because the gravity made it necessary, that walked into kinetic evaluation ranges wearing thin fabric shirts with old iron tools in their hair, that stood at impact lines with no combat stance and no drama, and struck dense matter silicate targets with the portion of their available force that the situation required. Not all of it. A portion. He looked at the empty square where the block had been. He thought, a species that wears no armor is not fragile. He looked at the caliper entry one more time. The iron, worn smooth on one grip from years of use in a workshop on a planet where the gravity never let you forget that weight was not an obstacle, it was a curriculum. He closed the system. He did not sleep well.